All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Okay, so I have a question for the students. Last week, I spoke, and we were in McNair, and it was a small group, and I said, you have to come out for this week. And look what happens. You have this full auditorium, but I don't take that personally. Because tonight, look, this amazing university is blessed with names like Watts and Haywood and Nash, and we have outstanding faculty today. Reed is one of those names. So to have Larry Reed back on campus, where he was a faculty member, professor, when he was a younger man, is a real blessing. And it's a blessing for me, Larry, to do the introduction for you today. So welcome back to Northwood University. So Lawrence Reed, our guest tonight, has written hundreds of articles and publications ranging from the Freeman and the Wall Street Journal to Human Events and the National Review. From 1977 to 1984, he just shared with me what he would do when he was a professor in this auditorium to get to know all of his students. He taught economics at Northwood University, and he served as our department chair from 1982 to 84. It was Mr. Reed that actually started this Freedom Seminar, developing the curriculum for the economics major, and was the first department chair of the economics department. In 1984, sadly for us, but a blessing for the country, he was able to become the chief economist at Western Monetary, a gold and silver company in Colorado, and left shortly after arriving to run the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives in Caldwell, Idaho. Well, it didn't last long either, because a prominent group of business people right here in Midland said, we need to get Larry back to Midland, and that's what he did. He came back here and he established the Mackinac Center right downtown. Some of you have worked there, and we've all benefited from it, where he served as that leader until 2008. Shortly after its establishment, the New York Times quickly referred to the Mackinac Center under Larry's leadership as being one of the largest and most influential state-level public policy think tanks in all of the United States. Reed then became president for the Foundation of Economic Education, we know it as FEE, in 2008, after serving as chairman of its board of trustees in the 1990s and writing and speaking for FEE since the 1970s. He has authored or co-authored 8 books, most recently being Was Jesus a Socialist?, a major expansion in 2020 of an earlier essay that he had written, and Real Heroes, inspiring true stories of courage and character and conviction. He's also co-authored or edited 5 additional books. His numerous recognitions include the Champion of Freedom Award from the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, the Distinguished Alumni Award from Grove City College, where he's, of course, a graduate, and the Citizen Warrior Award from the Heirs of the Republic. He's also, we're proudly to say, an honorary doctorate from here at Northwood University, as well as our friends at CMU. In 2022, Mr. Reed was named by the President of Poland as the recipient of the highest honor that Poland bestows upon a foreigner, the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. Another prominent U.S. resident received that, President Reagan. Since 2010, he has resided in Newman, Georgia, where he continues to write a column for the Newman Times-Herald. Earlier today, I spoke with our friend Dr. Nash, who's watching online with hundreds of other people tonight. And he said perhaps, in his view, the most important point was, along with Dale Haywood, Larry Reed was the co-author and co-editor of the first edition of our book, or our Bible here, When We Are Free, which was launched in 1981 and today is in its 6th edition. He also mentioned, and he sent me this note by text, that first edition had a magnificent chapter on the British Industrial Revolution written by a young, aspiring, then senior at Northwood by the by the name of Tim Nash. All right, so Tim snuck that in, Larry. He says hello tonight. We are grateful to the Boverick Foundation for the generous support of tonight's lecture. And I'll also say that Lawrence Larry Reed was born September 29th and celebrated his 72nd birthday just yesterday. Happy birthday to you. Ladies and gentlemen and students, please welcome Larry Reed.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald. Fellow students, I still call students fellow students because I think you ought to be a student for life. And I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be back in this room on this campus, the university that gave me my start literally half a century ago, or just about, 1977. I have so many memories from this classroom. I used to memorize my students within 10 minutes, all of their names. Any student from back at that time could tell you that. I don't know that I could do it today. But they would often then say, well, you only know us because you called us off in order. And I'd say, well, raise your hand randomly and I'll tell you what your name is. And I never missed a one, I'm happy to say, even when there were 150 students in this room. But Northwood gave me my start when I had just completed grad school. And I remember feeling pretty lucky. I thought, well, I know it's customary to send your resume to dozens of places, hoping that one of them might give you an offer. But I just felt like, no, I think I'll get it. And Northwood was the only place I sent my resume. And sure enough, I got an interview with Dr. Orville Watts. And he was the one who made the hire. That was in the summer of 1977. He was already then well into his 70s. And well into his 80s, I was playing tennis with him in the tennis courts here on campus. And I was always worried. I mean, he was in great health, but still in your 80s and you're playing somebody tennis, you kind of hope that he holds up through the last game, and he always did. And what a great trooper for liberty and for free markets Orville Watts was. So thanks for having me back to talk about a very serious subject with implications for our day, even though it's about a society that has been extinct for about 1,500 years. I always like to start any lecture on ancient Rome. I think we build this as Lessons from Ancient Rome. That may have been the title that you saw, or something close to that. I always like to talk about a story that I learned first from a man from Tennessee who became a good friend late in his life, Tom Anderson. He was a noted humorist who lectured all over the country. This was a story he was fond of telling about a group of wild hogs. This band of wild hogs that lived along a bend of a river somewhere in Georgia was a stubborn, ornery, independent, self-reliant bunch. They had survived floods and freezes and fires and hunters and dogs, you name it. Nobody thought that these wild hogs could ever be rounded up. But one day, a stranger came into town not far from where the hogs were, and he went into the general store where he said to the storekeeper, "Tell me where I can find the hogs. I have a plan to pen them up." And the storekeeper laughed at him and said, "Well, you'll never do that." But he gave him general directions, and off the stranger went with nothing but a few sacks of corn, a one-horse wagon, and an axe. And a few months later, he came back into town, went into that same store, and he said to the storekeeper, "Well, I've got them all penned up near the swamp. I need some help to bring the hogs out." The storekeeper couldn't believe it. He wanted to know, how did you do it? Other people came from miles around to hear the story of how this guy had penned the hogs that nobody thought could ever be captured. And the stranger said, "Well, it was really rather simple. At first, I built a clearing at the center of the forest. And I started putting some of the corn each day out into the center of the clearing. And for the first few days, none of the hogs would come out and take any of it. But after a while, the younger ones would scamper out, grab some of the corn, and scamper back into the underbrush. And before long, he said the older ones were coming, each of them probably figuring that if they didn't get their share, one of the other hogs would get it in their place. They all came regularly thereafter to take the corn that I was putting in the clearing. They stopped grubbing for roots and for acorns on their own. And he said it was about that time that I began to build a fence around the clearing, a little higher each day. And at the right place, he said, I built a trap door. And at the right moment, I sprung it. And his last line was, naturally, they squealed and hollered when they knew I had them. But I can round up any animal on the face of this earth if I can first get him to depend on me for a free handout. Now, there's a story to that I'm sure you've captured. And I'd like you to keep that in mind as we talk about the rise and fall of one of history's most notable civilizations. It's a story that applies not only to them, but perhaps many others as well. Do you know that during the awful winter of 1777 and 78 at Valley Forge, that terrible winter we all know about from our American history, when American colonial troops were struggling, freezing, starving, commanded by George Washington. During that dark moment, the darkest of the war for independence, George Washington did something that even senior members of Congress had asked him not to do. He asked for a play by Joseph Addison to be performed for the bedraggled troops. It was a play written 65 years before, well known on both sides of the Atlantic, in Britain and in the American colonies, about an ancient Roman by the name of Cato. And for those of you who know Roman history, you may recall that Cato gave his life, took his own life, rather than be subject to the rule of an authoritarian, of Julius Caesar in particular. He took his own life. Congressmen didn't want Washington to have this play performed because they thought it will only be dispiriting to the men because of what happened to Cato. He gave his life for the cause. And we don't want them to think about that. We want them to rally, come together, and in spite of the hardship, fight on and win this cause. But Washington thought, no, I think the men will be inspired by Cato and his sacrifice. And it turned out he was right. And Cato was well known at that time, not only to the leaders of our cause here in America, but reasonably well known even among ordinary Americans, because classical history was widely taught in the home and in our schools. Well, that was a remarkable moment for our commander-in-chief to disobey orders that came from senior members of Congress to have that play performed. An article by Michael Bishop, looking back on this period of Roman history when Cato was around, wrote this: Thomas Jefferson at William and Mary, James Madison at the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton, John Adams at Harvard, and George Washington in his private studies all devoured the poetry of Horace and Virgil, the speeches of Cicero, and the histories of the Roman historians Plutarch and Tacitus. The classics were the common language of the educated elite, or in the case of Washington, one who wished to move among them. But even those early Americans without the benefit of higher education or a well-stocked library, in other words, a vast majority, were, if they went to school at all, taught the rudiments of ancient history from a very young age. So when Washington talked about Cato, the audience, I think, likely knew who he was talking about, knew who the play was about. We know from the records that the influence on the early Romans, on America's founding fathers, was immense. When John Jay and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton collaborated to write 85 essays, collectively known as the Federalist Papers, to argue for the Constitution in the late 1780s. The pen name that they chose to write under was Publius. Publius Valerius was an ancient Roman and one of the founders of the early Roman Republic. Even the anti-federalists, who were opposed to the Constitution unless it included a Bill of Rights, which it ultimately did, even they would typically write under a Roman pen name. One of the most prominent members wrote under the name of Brutus, who was, from the beginning, in on the conspiracy to remove Julius Caesar from power. So know from the start that Roman history was important to America's founders. It had enormous influence on them, and I hope in what's to come here in the next half hour, I will tell you how. But Roman history, ancient Roman history, comprises 1,000 years, almost exactly 1,000 years. And interestingly enough, it's divided almost equally between 500 years as a republic and 500 years as an empire, a dictatorship, an imperial autocracy. And so often these days we'll refer to the Roman Empire as if that's the important part. But our founders would tell you, no, that was the sad part. That was a very different place than the first 500 years of the old republic. When they lost the republic, they degenerated into an imperial autocracy of dictatorship and tyranny, and ultimately lost their lives, their very civilization. But the first 500 years is the most remarkable period. That's the time of ancient Roman history that our founders in America thought, let's borrow all the good that we can from that period. And also because we know how it ultimately degenerated, let's avoid the bad things, the bad paths that they ultimately chose to go. And right smack in the middle, incidentally, happens to be the birth of Christ, almost exactly. He came upon the scene just 2 generations after the end of the Republic and while the empire was in its infancy. Well, it's that Republic period that I want to spend most of my time on tonight because, again, it had the greatest influence on our founders and it has the most lessons for us to learn today. There's so many things about it that will strike a chord with you from the American history that you know. You know that America, of course, was founded in a revolt against monarchy. So was the Roman Republic. They'd had 7 kings, finally had enough after the last one was particularly bad. And in 509 BC, the Republic was born when Romans rose up and overthrew the last of the kings. And they'd had enough of one-man concentrated power in the form of a monarch. They decided, we don't want anything that looks like that ever again. What are we going to do to set up a system that will not degenerate into one-man rule, that will preserve the liberties we think we're all entitled to? That was their mission. And did they ever do a masterful job? One of the greatest achievements in world history to date was the establishment of the Roman Republic. The first thing they did was they said, at the top of the government will not be one all-powerful man, but rather 2 people who will be called consuls. Right off the bat, they said, we don't want one guy having all the power. So if we have 2, maybe they'll fight amongst themselves and leave the rest of us alone. That was part of the theory behind it. But they named them consuls, and they stipulated what they could and couldn't do. They also arranged so that one could veto the decisions of the other. For them to get anything done, they had to agree on a policy. And guess what? They also adopted term limits. Anybody know how long the consuls had to serve before they had to leave office? Any guesses?
4 years.
4 years? Very generous. 1 year. 1 year. And they were gone. They had to be out. And they could not serve as consul again for many years thereafter, if at all. By the way, if you're interested in term limits, I found in research a few years ago, the place in world history that I think I've never found anybody with stricter term limits. I think they had the strictest term limits I've ever run across, was a country then called Ragusa. And it was the capital of Ragusa was what is today the city of Dubrovnik in Croatia on the Adriatic. And if you ever go to Dubrovnik, you can still walk the walls, the top of them, that were built by the Ragusans to protect the capital city. A lot of remnants of old Ragusa are still within those walls. But the top guy in Ragusa was the rector. Guess how long he had to serve? 1 month. I mean, he could barely move in, and it was time to move out. And he could not serve in that top position again for at least 2 years. So you can see there are peoples in world history that are so set against concentration of power in the hands of 1 or 2 people for any length of time that they've gone to great lengths sometimes to make sure that they can only go so far, and then they had to leave. Well, the Romans created those positions of consuls, 1 year apiece, but they also created a Senate. We derive the name of our upper house in Washington from the old Roman term for the Senate. That was made up of noble families who could trace their lineage to the earliest of Romans. And so it was not easy to get in that body. You typically couldn't get elected in it. Maybe generations later, they had occasional limited elections, but you got into that like you get into the House of Lords, you might say, in Britain, where you're of a noble family, noble background. But they didn't just do that. They realized the need for the greater mass of people to have some say in what their government would look like. So they created popular assemblies, 2 primary ones. The people could elect representatives to serve in those assemblies. There were things that these assemblies could do that the Senate couldn't. And over time, this will evolve to where the popular assemblies will gain more power at the expense of the Senate. So it evolved over time in the direction of more people having more say in what their government could do. They had a constitution too, but like Great Britain's, it was an unwritten constitution, but it was enormously important to Romans for hundreds of years. It was respected, it was looked up to, it was upheld because of its important precedents, the consensus around it. It was so important to early Romans that if you ran for an office and would even hint at not paying attention to the Constitution, that was a ticket to losing in the election. Fealty to the Constitution was something that Romans demanded. We have it for a reason. You don't just break it because it's convenient or because you think you have a better idea. They really respected that. And one of the reasons Rome fell, I'll tell you later, was in time, people came to regard their Constitution with less and less reverence. They began to think, that's kind of old-fashioned. There are other things we want to do, and the Constitution's always in the way, that kind of thing. That will happen a few hundred years later, but for a long time, the Constitution was revered as a law that the Romans would never sacrifice. So as Rome grew from that little village on the Tiber River to eventually not only control all of Italy, but most of the Mediterranean, and ultimately under the empire, it would go as far in its influence as the border between Britain and Scotland. It would take all of North Africa, much of the Middle East. This was a sprawling empire in years to come. But this was a time in the early Roman Republic of the development of institutions and customs that we in America are well acquainted with, thanks to our founders adopting them from the Romans. This was the time of habeas corpus. We take that for granted in America, habeas corpus, the right to know, what am I being held for? What are the charges? How long can I be held before a trial? Things like that. This was a Roman tradition. The veto has its origins in Roman history. The whole Roman government was set up with checks and balances. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Separation of powers, rule of law as opposed to the whims of individual men, property rights. They were regarded by Cicero as the main reason for a government in the first place, to protect the rights to property that people inherently had. Due process, in other words, you are faced with a trial and charges and presentation of witnesses, the right to question them. It's the whole process we call due process today had its origin in Roman law. Individual liberties were spoken of and written into their constitution for the first time in the ancient Roman Republic. Trial by jury. These are all things that we recognize today, but we didn't originate them. We made some improvements perhaps, but we borrowed them from the Romans. I don't want to suggest to you that the Roman Republic was perfect, because it wasn't. It was so far superior in many ways to just about anything that came before, but as a major blot on Rome, it did have slavery. But slavery was much more common in the rest of the world than it was for much of ancient Roman history. So they didn't go the full measure, but they certainly went far and created perhaps the freest society that the world had seen to that date. Dr. Joseph Warren was a great American patriot, often thought of as a founding father, maybe even before the founding fathers. He lost his life at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, more than a year before the Declaration of Independence. But he had already gained a reputation as an eloquent defender of individual rights and American independence. 3 years before he died, this would have been 1772, he gave a famous speech in Boston where he invoked the spirit of the Roman Republic and urged his fellow Americans to start thinking about doing what the Romans did, establishing an independent entity that would guarantee the rights of individuals and that would get rid of the monarchy. Here's what he said in that famous speech, referring to Rome. It was this noble attachment to a free constitution which raised ancient Rome from the smallest beginnings to that bright summit of happiness and glory to which she arrived. And it was the loss of this which plunged her from that summit into the black gulf of infamy and slavery. It was this attachment which inspired her senators with wisdom. It was this which glowed in the breasts of her heroes. It was this which guarded her liberties and extended her dominions, gave peace at home, and commanded respect abroad. Well, many prominent Americans at the time of our founding were avid readers of great Roman lawgivers and historians, of people like Livy and Tacitus and Sallust. And from those three in particular, our founders learned some important points. They learned, number one, that freedom requires strong personal character. Our founders, although they wrote a magnificent document in the Declaration of Independence and a magnificent constitution 11 years later, they never thought that mere pieces of paper could by themselves guarantee a nation's liberties. They always felt, you find many quotes from the founders who would say, we've done what we think is a magnificent job here and what we've written down, but ultimately it's what's in the hearts of the people that will determine whether this all survives. You probably know that famous line from Ben Franklin as he was leaving the Constitutional Convention in 1787. They had just written the Constitution. And a woman approached him and said, Mr. Franklin, what form of government have you given us? And Franklin's famous reply was, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And I think that was Franklin's way of saying, you know, what we've written is really magnificent. We've taken liberty further than anybody ever in the history of the world has gone. Not perfect. We think America is an experiment, and it should be ongoing and ever evolving and getting better all the time. But what a great start we've given you. But if you don't believe in it, if you look askance when it's violated, you'll lose it all. It all depends on what's in here, what's in your head, what's in your heart, as to whether or not you can keep what we've given you. That's what Franklin, I think, was saying. He knew, as the other founders did, that we didn't establish a democracy in 1776. It bothers me today every time I hear people talk about our democracy. And if our founders were here and heard that, they would say, wait a minute, we did not give you a democracy. If you have to have a name for what we gave you, it is a democracy within a republic. There's a difference. If we were a pure democracy, that would mean everybody gets to vote on everything. How unwieldy, unworkable would be that? And there are some things that we should never have a vote on, like whether or not to take your rights away. What if somebody says, hey, let's have the democratic process here. Let's have a show of hands. How many think we should reinstitute slavery? I think you would say, wait a minute, you cannot by majority vote take away other people's freedoms. That's one thing that democracy cannot and should not even think about ever doing. We have a republic, which means we elect representatives. Now, we elect them democratically, just like the Romans did. In other words, you want to run for Congress, and there's just one other candidate, then whoever gets 50% plus one gets to be the congressman. In some states where there isn't a runoff required, as we have in Georgia, then if a runoff is required, then the top two vote getters have to go at it again in a general, and then 50% plus one will win the election. But that's democratic in a sense. But then we don't elect these representatives and send them off and say, now, every time you have a vote in Congress, make sure you come back and ask us to vote too. I mean, that would be ridiculous. We hope that the people we send to places like Congress will have enough smarts to render the right judgment on these things. And I'd be the first to say they don't always do have that. But nonetheless, it'd be far better than asking every American to vote on every single thing that ever comes up. It's just ridiculous and unwieldy. That's the Republican aspect of our government. We are a democracy within a republic, not a democracy by itself, nor a pure republic in the sense that we do settle some things by majority vote. One of the best known ancient Romans, certainly my favorite, is a man I want to tell you about now, because the story of this man is the story of the last decades of the Roman Republic. The big question is, well, how did they lose it all? I've painted a picture that, what a great achievement this was to create this Roman Republic. It just stood out amongst the tyrannies of the world as a shining example of what can be accomplished by a free people. Became the center of the world's wealth, but they lost it. Why did they lose it? What happened? What gave way ultimately to the dictatorship of the empire? Well, I have to say, I'll give you three reasons, and I want to tell you about this one particular person. If you look back in the ancient republic and try to find, well, when did they start to decline? When did they begin to move away from these great achievements, these personal liberties guaranteed, and a stable political process, and descend into conflict, violence, and dictatorship? It began in the 140s BC. Well, that tells you right off the bat that this was just 100 years before the Roman Republic expired. So I'm saying it was in the last 100 years that profound changes began that would lead to their decay and the end of the Republic. What were those changes? I'll give you three big reasons for the decline of the Republic. One, foreign adventures. Foreign adventures. In his book, Empires of Trust by Thomas Madden, a phenomenal book, you won't be able to put it down, where he draws parallels between the Roman Republic and recent American history, Empires of Trust. He talks about how before the 140s, and for the most part, few exceptions, but when Rome went to war somewhere, it was for justifiable defensive reasons to defeat a threat, that kind of thing. And they typically wouldn't then occupy a place they took over until they cleaned it up, and then they'd leave. Greece, for instance, he talks about how Greece early on, the first time the Romans came and took Greece, the Greeks thought that the Romans were probably going to stay, and now they were conquered. But the Romans said, no, we're just here to protect you from the Persians, because we know if they take you over, they'll come after us next. So they defeated the Persians and then left the Greeks alone. They said, bye-bye. The Greeks were amazed. Wow. They came, they conquered, and then they left. That was Rome in its early days. But in time, Romans began to realize, hey, there's some benefit from conquering other territories. We should keep them. And we can bring some of their people here and make them slaves. And that was a very costly endeavor too. It was the expense of the foreign adventures that really would come to bite them in the rear here at home, as they were paying for sending Roman troops all over the place. That was one of the reasons for the decline. Those foreign adventures had some other negative effects at home too. They would frequently reward victorious generals by giving them generous grants of land and letting them bring some of those conquered people in as slaves. Well, what does that mean then for you as a small Roman farmer? How can you compete with this general who gets a nice big tract of land and has slaves to work it for him? So increasingly, it creates rural poverty amongst farmers because they can't compete with the subsidized ones who get the land and the slaves from the Roman government. A second and bigger reason for the decline of the Republic was the rise of the Roman welfare state. It was also in the 140s that you have politicians beginning to promise people benefits at other people's expense, buying votes with public money, also promising land redistribution. And because some of the land ownership had come into being because of those foreign conquests, there was some basis of good argument for it. But it went further to where politicians would say, vote for me and I'll give you land. And they also started in the 140s a public dole, or subsidy, welfare, in the form of subsidized grain. In time, the Roman state would graduate from just subsidized grain to free grain for the masses, who came to depend upon that as a important staple in the Roman diet. And of course, with every welfare state, you have the endless problem of how do you keep it limited? The moment you say, well, this group, because they're special, or we like them, or we need their votes, let's give them something. Then you have invariably other people over time who will say, well, wait a minute, why do I have to be the guy that pays for that? I'm important. Shouldn't I get something? Hey, give me some benefits as well. It's always a challenge to keep any welfare state from growing beyond the benefits for a few to benefits for everybody at everybody's expense. A full-grown welfare state is like everybody standing in a big circle. Each person has his hands in the next guy's pocket. That's a welfare state at its ripest. The third reason why the Republic declined was the erosion of constitutional norms to satisfy the first two reasons. The erosion of constitutional norms. In other words, people would say, oh, the Constitution, well, we can break it, when it's really important to, or we don't have to adhere to it, just violate it. You had politicians, consuls, who were supposed to serve 1 year, who would say increasingly when their time was up, oh, you really need me. There's nobody as good as me. I can't be replaced, so I'll just stick around for another year. One consul named Marius, very famous in Roman history, he ended up serving, I put that in quotes, 7 terms. Each time arguing that state of emergency, you need me, I'm more important than anybody else, nobody can do it but me. And when people said, well, okay, that's a sign of the erosion of constitutional norms. There was a time in ancient Rome, early in the Republic, when people wouldn't have put up with that. They would have said, you either get lost or we're coming after you. But over time, they thought, well, other things like handouts are more important than the Constitution. That's why Rome fell. But one of the last Romans to see all this and to protest it, and ultimately give his life because of his views, was Marcus Tullius Cicero. How many have heard of Cicero? Cicero. Great Roman. I have a bust of him, and as you walk in my front door, the first thing you see is a bust of Cicero. The greatest of the defenders of the old Roman Republic, the greatest of the defenders of the liberties and the customs and the values of the old Roman Republic. And he's born in 106 BC. So this process of degeneration has been going on for 30, 40 years at this point when he's born. And he lives to see the crumbling decades of the Roman Republic. He starts out as a lawyer. and becomes not only Rome's best, at least in the view of many, but also perhaps Rome's greatest orator, known for giving these powerful speeches in the Roman Senate. Do you know that we know more from Cicero himself about him and what he thought than we do from anybody else in the history of the world before 1000 AD? That's how much we know about this guy, because he had a scribe for much of his life who took extensive notes, and that stuff on tablets were preserved or discovered after thought lost. And now we have a wealth of information of what Cicero said and what he stood for. He was much beloved by American founders who saw him as a courageous Roman standing up against the winds of history to try to preserve the values that were being eroded. Well, Cicero climbed the ladder of office. They called it the cursus honorum in Rome, where you would progress from one elected job to a higher one by vote of the people until you got to the top. And if you were lucky, you might be elected one of the two consuls. Cicero made it all the way, never lost an election, all the way to the top, became a consul. And just like the old legendary Cincinnatus of Rome, whom George Washington is often likened to, because Cincinnatus did the job and then went back to the farm. He didn't keep the power that he was given by declaring some national emergency. Cicero, first year in office, or his 1 year in office, within months, he discovers there is a conspiracy by another senator named Catiline to overthrow the Roman government. He had his own army poised to invade Rome. Cicero has intelligence that tells him that this is about to happen. And in the Senate, with Catiline sitting in the front row, Cicero unloads on him. And before Cicero is done, Catiline flees, and it leads to a battle, and Catiline's forces lose. And Cicero is named savior of the Republic. He saved the Republic in its dying hours. And he could, because he was so popular at that point, he could have said, oh, let me hang around another year. When his year was up, he said, that's the way we run our republic. I'm out of here. And folks, you elect somebody else to replace me. I'm not after power for life. Well, that was in 63 BC. Within 20 years, you have the rise of Julius Caesar, who finally, with his army threatening the Senate, demands that the Senate name him emperor for life. Some people say that's when the Republic ended, when Julius Caesar was given the title emperor for life. I don't think it was quite over yet, because Cicero came out of retirement and blistered Julius Caesar in a series of speeches you can still read to this day. He warns the Roman people, you are about to lose your liberties. The whole thing is about to end with this one guy who wants all power centered in himself. Well, how long did Caesar's emperor for life position last? 1 month. And Brutus, another senator, along with a group of conspirators, assassinated Julius Caesar because they were defenders of the Republic. They did not want to see the Republic come to an end. So they said the only way we can take care of this is to cut the head of the snake off and hope that the Republic can be revived. Mark Antony, a name you'll recognize, he comes to power immediately. The question is, will he recognize the old Republic? Will he restore individual liberties in the wake of Caesar's assassination? Will he do what the assassins were hoping to do, to restore the Republic? Nope. He was power hungry just like Caesar. And in fact, he hated Cicero so much that he dispatched an assassin. And in December of 43 BC, the assassin hits his mark and assassinates Cicero. That, I think, is when the Republic ended. because there was no one else after Cicero who would speak out with the kind of boldness that he would, who would defend Roman liberties. He was the last of them. Everybody else was either on board or too afraid to say anything. Mark Antony now had all power. Of course, he wouldn't have it very long because everything degenerated into further civil war, and he lost that conflict to Octavius, who became the first emperor, Augustus. But the republic was no more. I think it ended with Cicero's assassination. A quick word, and then we'll go to questions, about what happened after the republic fell. This great experiment in human freedom and a framework for limited government. Now it's history. Now we have a dictator. What happens after that? Well, Rome will go on for another 500 years as a dictatorship. And that some of the craziest and bloodiest tyrants in world history will come to power. Within the first 100 years of the empire, you have notorious figures like Nero and Caligula ascending to the top. And now with all power concentrated in the state, they could do just about anything they wanted to do to anybody. Interestingly, Rome never formally announced the end of the republic. They even kept the Senate. Didn't have any power, but they kept the Senate. They'd give lip service to the republic. Oh yeah, we're just making changes, but it's, we're still the old Rome. Anybody with common sense knew that that was history, but they kept some of those institutions that made it look like they still were a free republic all the way up until they were taken over by barbarians in 476 AD. There was still a Roman Senate in 476 AD, even though it had no power. The emperors had it all. But the welfare state will continue and continue to grow during the empire as emperors sought to give out public benefits to buy the support of various factions in the public. And the question is, well, now that you're even doing more foreign adventures, sending troops all over the place and being attacked by barbarians, that's pretty costly too. And you're growing the welfare state at home, how are you going to pay for that? So the Rome of low taxes and limited government now over time gives way to a Rome of sky-high taxes, regulations, nationalizations, state ownership of one industry after another. How do you pay for all this stuff? Well, in our day, when we have a problem with government taking care of its bills, it will borrow or ultimately print. But they didn't have paper money back then. The Roman currency was coin of gold and silver. But the Romans discovered, hey, there is a way we can manufacture more money, that the government can do that, so it has more to spend. Let's just reduce the silver and gold content of the coinage. Put junk metal in there, melt the coins, and then into the molten stuff, we'll add tin and junk metals, have a bigger mass of metal from which to make more coins. Of course, each one now will have less gold and silver. They did that generation after generation, emperor after emperor. There was one emperor by the name of Pertinax. I want to mention him because I don't want you to think that every Roman emperor was evil. They mostly were, but this guy tried to make a difference in 192 AD. This is known in Roman history as the year of 5 emperors. 5 of them, because each one gets knocked off. But Pertinax is the first. On January 1st, New Year's Day, he becomes the new emperor of Rome upon the death of his predecessor. Pertinax is regarded by historians as one of the smarter ones and one of the more honest emperors who had some character about him. He saw what Romans had done to themselves, and he saw the debasement of the currency as central to this wickedness of the government, and he said, we're going to stop that. He was the first one to actually increase the silver and gold content of the coinage. He said, we're going to restore the integrity of our currency. And of course, he told Romans that we've got to cut spending. We have to cut spending. But it's a measure of how far Romans had slid by that point, morally and otherwise, that they wouldn't let him do it. He was successful briefly in restoring some integrity to the currency, but he couldn't cut spending. The Praetorian Guard, the sort of the royal protectors who hung around the emperor and increasingly would control who gets to be emperor, They would not have this. They loved public spending because they were often the recipients of it, or their friends, their allies. And so Pertinax, even though he would give speeches about the need to get all this in order, to restore sound money and cut public spending, the Praetorian Guard finally had enough of that, and he lasted just shy of 90 days as emperor and was assassinated. And there were 4 more before the year is out. So there were attempts like that to try to stop this erosion, but they were not very long lasting. And ultimately, in 476 AD, Rome fell like a ripe plum. That's the year that we say ancient Rome ceased to exist. In the West, anyway. The eastern part of the empire centered in Istanbul, or Constantinople, known in those days. That will persist for another 1,000 years, but Rome, from Rome, no longer exists when the barbarians invade. And Roman government and Roman society fell like a ripe plum, almost without opposition. I'm sure there were many Romans in 476 AD who thought, gee, anything's better than the tyranny of our own tax collectors, our own tyrants who destroyed the currency, taken our liberties, and run roughshod over the people. Anything, let's try anything but what these guys have given us. I'm sure there was some of that sentiment. So that's the year Rome ceased to exist. You can never assume that because a society has a great moment, that it will always have great moments. Because ultimately, where a society goes is determined by what's up here, how people think. If their ideas change and change for the worse, that will be reflected in society as a whole. So time and time again, we've seen civilizations like Rome arise to greatness, often because of personal character, because of certain values, respect for others, respect for their rights, and so forth. And then in time, you find time and time again when their support, their loyalties are bought cynically by politicians who do it with other people's money. That is the course of disaster throughout history, time and time and time again. You might say, well, aren't we seeing that today? I'll let you be the judge. But there are many eerie similarities between what happened to the Roman Republic and what we see around us. But no moment is ever too late to do something to stop it. With that, I'll say thank you and open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Reed, for sharing such valuable insights on the fall of Rome and modern parallels. I am Bella Smiley, a student in the Freedom Seminar class and a senior studying data analytics. We would now like to open it up to a Q&A. We have a few questions submitted prior to this evening by students participating in the Freedom Seminar itself. We invite the audience to ask questions as well. A microphone will be passed around if you would like to ask a question for Mr. Reed. To start the Q&A, I would like to first ask, as you stated, we know that history tends to repeat itself. What would be specific areas that the American government should target right now to slow and reverse the decline?
Did you all hear the question? What could the American government do today? Well, if all it did was get its fiscal house in order, I'd be a very happy person because fiscally, the American government has in recent decades been unbelievably profligate and disastrous. We now have a national debt approaching $40 trillion. And now we pay interest on that national debt in an amount that even exceeds what we spend every year for defense. We spend more on interest on past debt than we spend to defend ourselves. And the deficit this year, and just this year's federal budget, is going to be approaching $2 trillion. Gee, I can remember when the federal government total spending was way under $1 trillion. And now just the deficit is twice that. Just the difference between what we take in and what we actually spend. Well, that sends a terrible message economically as well as morally. Morally, I think it's even more reprehensible than it is economically, because what it says is that Americans are okay today with spending money on themselves or foreigners or fill in the blank and sending the bill to kids not yet born. To me, that is morally reprehensible. I don't know how you look another person in the face and say, for my goodies, I'm sending you the bill by way of the government after they keep their cut. I just think that's dirty, rotten, stinking business. And yet we do it now as a national pastime every year. So if they could do nothing else but get the fiscal house in order by slashing spending, not raising taxes. We don't have a deficit because we tax too little. We have a deficit because we spend too much. That would be a clear sign that we've turned the corner in the right direction. But do you hear that very often in Washington? Anybody talking about balancing the budget? Not many.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Our second question is, what role did civic virtue play in Rome's success, and do you think that America still values that idea today?
Oh, civic virtue. Yes, in fact, the Romans virtually invented it. Maybe the Athenians had a lot to say on that too before them, but Romans were known in the early days for a very great measure of civic virtue. Some of our terms that we use today harken back to those days, like gravitas, dignity, dignitas. There was a sense in the early Roman Republic that men in particular, because women weren't given much political power for a long time, but there was a sense that men should be upright, examples for others. They should maintain high standards of personal character. That's how a country is successful. Somebody who displays profligacy in their financial affairs or drunkenness in public and that kind of loosey-goosey stuff, Romans would frown upon. They would say, no, you don't meet our standards. We can't be free if we're a bunch of lazy louses who aren't responsible citizens or who don't participate in public affairs. But that was all lost in the late Roman Republic as well. It became sort of every man for himself, or my loyalties are to the general who gave me free stuff instead of the central government in Rome. That breakdown of civic virtue was a big factor in their ultimate decline, no question.
Thank you. Does this similar decline stem from policies, or rather political officials currently in office, not just the president? Is this a matter of regaining cooperation between opposing political parties, or is it the individuals causing harm?
Oh, great question. We do tend often to put too much blame on prominent politicians, and I may have sounded like I was doing that. I hope not. But I think ultimately most politicians are reflective of the people back home, the people who either behave the way that politician does or look askance when he misbehaves or don't hold him accountable for the bad things he does. What really determines a society and whether they'll become great and lasting is not the quality of the politicians they elect, but rather the quality of character they maintain in their hearts. I'm a firm believer that personal character is the most important. Next to your settling an important spiritual matter with your God, and our subject tonight is not theology, so I won't delve into that, but it is even more important. But next to that is your personal character. It's the one thing over which you have virtually total control, at least at some point in your life. You could decide whether you're a person of character or not. And I'm just amazed at how many people go through life without ever giving that a second thought, without thinking about it carefully. And often they die with a horrible legacy. And I would not want on my epitaph anything like words to the effect, he knew what was right, but he still didn't do it. Or he only thought of the short run instead of the long run. Or everything came back to, it was all about him, not anybody else. He didn't care how he raised his children. He was interested only in getting something at other people's expense for himself. He encouraged bad behavior instead of discouraged. I wouldn't want any of those as epitaphs. But all of that is a function of your character. How honest are you? How responsible are you? How humble are you? How courageous are you when courage is required? How grateful are you for all the wonderful things that come your way that aren't of your doing? Those are qualities of character. Optimism is another. How are you a person of optimism? How many here would say you're optimistic for your future? Not necessarily society's, but at least your future. How many would say, oh, good, okay. How many are optimistic for society at large? Okay, it's always a smaller number. But, it's awfully hard to swim against the tide. So if you're right about society, it's going to be harder for you to get ahead. But I'm glad there's that much optimism. I like to tell people that if you're optimistic, or if you're pessimistic, just the opposite, two bad things happen. One, you don't work hard for what you know to be right, because in your heart, you've already given up, right? You're pessimistic, future's lost. So why are you going to work hard for what you know to be right if you've already given up the battle? And the second bad thing that happens is you're not going to be a person of any influence. People don't want to sign up for a lost cause. All right, if I came here tonight and said, hey, I want to sign you all up for the cause of liberty, but I have to tell you, we're going to lose, how many would say, sign me up? So we have to find ways to not only be optimistic, but to exude it in a fashion that will attract others. I've always had the trait, I don't know where it came from, but I will tell you a Midland story about it. It was in February of 1980. I was coming from home to campus about 7:30 in the morning. And if you think of Main Street, coming towards the campus from downtown, where, what's that street that's, right where Main Street kind of takes a dip, the railroad tracks are on your left, and it's a ravine that's not as deep as it was then. Orchard, okay. There was a car coming, like as if it was coming from the campus in the other direction, waiting for me to come through, and they were going to turn left on, I guess, Orchard. And then I swerved to miss it it was a very icy morning, and rolled the car upside down. It ended up in the ravine upside down. And I remember exactly how I felt the moment it was happening and what went through my mind as the car was rolling. You remember this, don't you, Dennis? When I totaled the car. I was completely, serenely calm about it. Most people would be terrified. But I was completely calm, and what popped into my head was, I'm going to get a new car out of this. That's a kind of inherent optimism. Yeah, happened right half a mile from here. So for what that's worth, look for reason to be optimistic.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. If America faces a collapse similar to Rome's, what exactly would that mean? And how would the daily lives of most Americans be affected?
Okay. That's a big question, isn't it? I don't want you to think that I am of the view that automatically we must go the way of Rome. Because being an optimist, I think that people can come to their senses. Sometimes you don't know how or why, but there can be an event, a personality, who knows what, that snaps us to attention, and we realize what we put ourselves into and we fix it. I'm still hoping for that and still betting that it will happen at some point. But if it doesn't, then if we do go the way of the old Roman Republic and lose our liberties, we will ultimately lose virtually everything else. Our prosperity depends upon the liberties that we have. Your freedom of speech and assembly all depend upon the liberties that we have. Most of the people who have ever lived on this planet have not had those kinds of liberties. Most people, the 8 billion now on the earth, and who knows how many others who came before, most of them have lived as slaves or as serfs or in some kind of regime where they were in constant fear of the people at the top who could wipe them out if they so desired. That's the way most of the world has lived. We're an exception. Freedom is an exception in history. It's not the rule. But we do know that in its absence, in the absence of freedom, you can get some really dark moments indeed. I don't even want to think about what it could mean, but we could never sustain the population that we have today with a fraction of the freedoms that we have. So there go there goes maybe 2/3 of our population in time right there. Without a free economy to sustain our lives, most will not make it. Those will be some pretty dark days. That's the worst case scenario that I'm still hopeful and working to make sure it doesn't happen. But get involved in whatever way you can to make sure it doesn't. And you can start by just being the very best example you can be in your life. Most people learn by example, don't they? They learn by the heroes that they see around them, whether it be their parents perhaps or other people who have achieved great things. That's how we learn the most lasting things. So be the best example you can be in everything that you do. And you'll be amazed at the influence you can have. And when someday our society looks back and says, we saved ourselves, it'll be because of people like you who put character at the highest priority.
Speaking, argue that Rome's downfall was more cultural than financial. Do you think that culture matters more than economists in keeping a nation strong?
Yes, I do. I wish I could say that economists mostly determined all this, because even though there are plenty of us who are wrong, I would take the average economist over the average acid rock rapper or whatever that I can think of. Culture plays an extremely important role in society. It's the transmission belt, you might say. We can have great ideas and write them up and put them in books and so forth, but so many people are affected in their thinking by the culture that they absorb, what they see in others that seem to be attractive to them, that lures them in, that says, oh, this is the way you ought to be, this is the way you ought to think. That's probably more impactful, although I understand that's not really a word, but we use it. It's more impactful than books, as important as books are. Culture is very important. That's why I say we need to, those of us who believe in freedom and free markets need to do more to capture the culture, to work our ideas into song and into plays and movies, and so that people can turn on the TV or go to a movie and see something inspiring that makes a hero of a person who does the right thing. Wouldn't it be nice to see more of that? So we absorb a lot more from culture, I think, than we do from books.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. My last question for the evening. If we are headed toward a collapse, what can the average person do to try to prevent this? And how long do we have to address issues before it's too late?
Oh, well, like I say, I don't know that we're headed to collapse. I'm trying to do all I can to prevent it. But it may be true that we may see tougher times before we see better times. We have an awful lot of bills to pay for somehow at some point. Even if we balance the budget today, we'd still have nearly $40 trillion to work off. So we've fixed ourselves into a situation where it can't be painless to completely get out of it. But what can we do? I guess maybe in other ways I've sort of answered that. I would say focus first on the areas where you have the greatest control, your personal character. Spend more time building yourself up than in tearing anybody else down. When I say build yourself up, I mean improving your character. And you'll be amazed at the influence you can have as a result of that. So don't think it's to solve this problem, it just has to be we got to get other people to do something. Yeah, that's part of it. But it really, you're not going to get them to do those things if you're not a good practitioner of it yourself, a good spokesman for those things yourself. If you live differently from what you say, if you're a hypocrite. So work on all those, and the ability to influence others will flow from that.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Mr. Reed again for the illuminating presentation of the fall of Rome and modern parallels.
Hey, thank you. You can open any questions for the audience. Thank you, John.
Does anyone from the audience have any questions for Mr. Reed?
I may have gone over, so if you have to go, I'll not be offended, but I'm happy to take another couple of questions if we have to. Yes, sir.
Everyone in this audience has felt your optimism for the future of America. What do you see today that gives you that sense of optimism that we can all hope to live out in our daily lives?
Okay. Yeah. What do I see today? Well, I might not have said this 3 weeks ago, but I have to say that maybe even Charlie Kirk, if he were with us today, I think he would say he is quite proud of what seems to be happening as a result of his untimely death. It seems to have sparked a new awakening across the country. That doesn't mean we all now have to go out and be clones of Charlie Kirk. He would say, he'd be the first to say, I'm not perfect in everything. But in terms of more people getting more excited about things like freedom, free speech, and limited government and personal character, I think there's a revival underway. I saw signs of it even before 3 weeks ago, but I think now we've got such a boost. So I'm optimistic. Younger generations, I think, are hearing these ideas and they're resonating with them. So I have high hopes. But again, it's easy to get all caught up in looking for, why can I find something to be optimistic about? I would say, let the world take care of that. Just be as optimistic as you can. Be the person who makes the things happen that give a reason to people to be optimistic. And those changes for the better will happen. But don't get caught up if you see for the moment what look like sometimes only bad signs. Sometimes the world is in the worst possible shape when things turn around. I remember in 1989, almost nobody was talking about the Soviet Empire was about to end. Hardly anybody. And yet I remember when it happened so vividly. And you look back on it and you think, how did that happen? How did an entire empire collapse virtually overnight? How did millions of people be liberated in a matter of no time at all? It wasn't some sudden thing that has no prior explanation or prior events. It was the result of things we didn't necessarily notice that were happening below the surface. You look at the big events that change world history from time to time, like the 1989 collapse of the Soviet Empire. You'll find, as you look back on it, that 3 big factors came into play that we couldn't have predicted: personalities, events, and ideas. You get the right combination or constellation of powerful ideas, personalities, and events, bam, big things can happen in no time at all. And that's what happened there. You had Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II and Lech Walesa in Poland, great resistance fighters for freedom in so many East European satellite countries of the Soviet Union, working hard for their liberties. And then you had ideas of liberty that were making the rounds like never before. And then you had events like the obvious collapse of the Soviet economy, when people said, look, it doesn't work, socialism, they've had it for decades, it sucks. All of that stuff at one time just sent a powerful signal and the world changed. So I hope we can see something like that in our lifetime again, in the right direction, like we saw in 1989. Yes, sir. Daryl, good to see you.
Larry, welcome back to you.
Uh-huh.
I don't know a lot about young people and the influencers that you hear about. They want to be influencers, but I want to share with you. I've respected and admired you all the years I've known you.
Thank you.
And I believe in the last 40 years of my being in this community, that you're one of the greatest influencers Midland's ever had.
Oh my gosh.
In the 30 years that you were here.
Oh, you're very kind. I didn't pay him to say that. Thank you. It was this place that gave me my start. I do have a website. I encourage you all to look at it, lawrencewreed.com. If you go to the blog section, I put new stuff up every week. And the foundation I'm connected with, Foundation for Economic Education, they have a website, fee.org. We're doing webinars and in-person seminars for college students all the time, all over the country and abroad. So those are 2 websites, mine and Fee's, to look up, and hope you'll enjoy what you find. How many baseball fans are there here? Oh, okay, well, let me tell you, I'm one too. And in the blog section of my website, you'll find just within recent weeks, 3 or 4 Where's Derek? I saw him a minute ago. Hey, Derek, you know, 3 or 4 essays on great baseball players and the values they taught, like Satchel Paige and Roberto Clemente and Stan Musial and who's the 4th one I wrote about? Well, you'll go on the website, you'll see it. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. As we conclude this evening, we would also like to invite you to attend the upcoming Freedom Seminar events. Here at Northwood, we believe that freedom, individual responsibility, and enterprise are essential for human progress. The Freedom Seminar provides us with a deeper understanding of these values and how they can be applied to improve public policies, business, and our personal lives. Next week's topic, The Entrepreneurs Who Made America, will be presented by Dr. Dr. Dale Moeller, Assistant Professor of Northwood University. You are invited to come at 6 p.m. October 2nd to Plaster Room 120-121. For those who are recording your participation for class, the Impact Program, or the TNI Badging Program, please be sure to scan the QR code on the flyers located throughout the lobby and submit the form prior leaving this evening. Once again, thank you, Mr. Reed, for your valuable insights, and have a wonderful night.
Hey, audience, run me a seat.